Ford. East Bud Adams tollway traffic's heavy from past Lee to the tri-state. That's traffic. I'm Chip Talamonte on AM 560 The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. Your official Chicagoland weather forecast from our 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Sunny and cool today. High 52. 39 officially now at O'Hare. Your next news update is at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by The Mortgage Update with Dan Frio. Every Saturday morning at 7 on AM 560, The Answer.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
Daddy, what do taxes pay for?
Oh, why, everything. Policemen, trees, sunshine.
On AM 560.
And let's not forget the folks who just don't feel like working, God bless them.
The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. That was some performance on Thursday night by the Democrat Socialist candidates for POTUS at that CNN LGBTQ town hall hosted by Fredo and Cricket and Gloria Vanderbilt's kid. And one of the exchanges that went viral to some extent, second to Elizabeth Warren's canned, pithy rejoinder to those who don't support the redefinition of marriage, was Bobby O'Rourke. Bobby O'Rourke still trying to restart his campaign for the 72nd time.
Well, and sometimes I think he just says things because he's so desperate that he's trying to get some attention, some traction from some crazy component of the Democratic Party.
I think that's right. I think it's a combination of that, and he's a dope. So that's probably what leads you to make statements like this.
This is from your LGBTQ plan, and here's what you write. This is a quote. Freedom of religion is a fundamental right, but it should not be used to discriminate. Do you think religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?
Yes.
Oh.
There can be no reward, no benefit, no tax break for anyone or any institution, any organization in America that denies the full human rights and the full civil rights of every single one of us. And so as president, we're going to make that a priority, and we are going to stop those who are infringing upon the human rights of our fellow Americans.
How you like your Democrat Socialist Party now, Democrats who profess to be people of faith? Like Muslims who attend mosques and African Americans who attend black churches that don't support the redefinition of marriage because they support the biblical view of marriage. Tax exempt status stripped. That would sort of eliminate a separation of church and state in point of fact, which is why the tax exemption was initiated going back to, certainly a seminal 1970 case by the Supreme Court, Walls. But before that, it goes back another 100 years. Separation of church and state. This is supposedly something that the secularists are always bandying about. Of course, no understanding because of the sentimental nature of Bobby's anti-discrimination statement, that you miss the point that this would necessarily introduce the government into houses of worship because, of course, the only way to enforce a stricture that would say you can't support the traditional definition of marriage, for example, would be for the government to enforce it and strip your tax-exempt status, right? So that's government as censor in your place of worship. Game for that? Democrat Socialists? Is your hatred of Trump enough to indulge that? Because let me tell you something. Bobby O may be the only one dumb enough and desperate enough to make that statement, but he's not the only one who subscribes to it on that stage that night. For more on this topic, as well as some of the important cases before SCOTUS this term, including that Detroit funeral home case, we're pleased to be joined by David Cortman, Senior Counsel and Vice President of U.S. Litigation with the Alliance for Defending Freedom. David, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good for having me on.
So, what about some of the forays into faith that were offered by the likes of Bobby O'Rourke on Thursday night?
It's so remarkable on so many different fronts. You almost don't know where to start. But at the top level is they do it under the guise of anti-discrimination, when actually what they're implementing is discrimination against certain people who hold certain beliefs. And so the fact that they trumpet this inclusiveness, but yet what they do is exclude, groups of people from all different faiths or no faith at all, it seems to be lost on them, and is quite remarkable.
Well, I think it's intentional, right? I mean, he starts by saying, of course, I believe in the fundamental right to freedom of religion, except for people who disagree with me. That sort of undermines any concept of fundamental right, but that's fine. You have to make the pro forma statement, then you make the hypocritical one, and being a leftist provides you the privilege to do so.
Yeah, and imagine if it was just flip it around, their suggestion that we're going to take anyone who actually supports same-sex marriage and we're going to strip them of tax deductions, credits, tax exemptions across the board, how the left would go crazy, yet that's actually what they're advocating for.
Although I got to say, I appreciate Bobby's unintentional candor or his desperation, whatever the intersection of the two, because you want people to be transparent about what they would actually do and who they actually are, and he gave us a lot of transparency on Thursday night.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and I think people, if you're fair-minded, and I think this supersedes politics or left and right or conservative and liberal. If you look as a whole, here's the question I think of: if your group's not in power, do you want this law there, rule there, policy there? And it seems to be if you would say, well, look, I don't want this to happen to me. I may not like what you believe. I may not agree with you, putting all the inclusivity and all this other stuff to the side for a minute. I wouldn't want the other side to have this power, so I'm not going to give it to my side. And you would think in politics, especially when the winds change so frequently and administrations changes from left to right and who's in power, that you wouldn't want to give the other side that type of authority to do it to you, and yet that's what we keep hearing from the left, and it's just quite remarkable.
Let's move to that Detroit funeral home case, what looks to be a seminal case in determining whether or not trans is a protected class in America. After oral arguments, how should we understand this case is being received by the High Court?
Yeah, I think it was received pretty well. This is another one of those issues where, a couple of questions. Can you rely on the law the way it's been, for 50, 60 years, or does some executive agency get to change it overnight? And then who makes the law? I mean, we generally understand when we go to school and when we're young that the legislative branch is the one who makes the law, not the courts or the executive branch. And in this case, they just changed the law to say, well, the sex, which basically meant man and woman biologically, and by the way, Title VII and these protections for workplace employment were meant to help women, to give them a better chance in the workplace. And now they're trying to redefine that through the courts and saying, okay, that means transgender status, which is some amorphous perception of yourself with not rooted in biology or anything else. And I don't think the majority of their court is going to accept that change.
And just the backstory on the case, again, we've talked about it in this show, but to refresh everybody's memory, this is a fifth-generation funeral home in Detroit. They have an employee that everything was going along fine. Then the employee decided that he was a she and wanted to live out being a she in the employment setting, and that's where the problem arose.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like many places, they have codes of conduct and dress codes. And the funeral home is ministering to grieving people, so they want their employees to kind of just fit into the background, not to be a spectacle, not to be showy, and they want them just to blend in, so it's all about the grieving families. And this gentleman actually agreed to this dress code and had been following it for 6 years before one day he came in and said, I'm no longer going to dress as a man, I'm going to dress and present as a woman. And they said, no, we can't have that here. And ironically, the agency, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a government agency, they're the ones who first went after this ministry. They have their own dress code for men and women.
Of course.
Yeah, you just don't understand some of this stuff.
Yeah. Would they be willing, though, to change if one of their male employees suddenly felt like a female?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends in who's in office at the time. And so this started under the previous administration, and then the new administration said, no, this is wrong because you're changing the law. You can't do that. Congress has to do it, and then went back to the original meaning, which was the right thing to do.
I know this is always dangerous business to try to divine a justice's perspective from the questions he or she asked during all arguments, but there was some accounts of the Q&A during all arguments on this case that suggested that Neil Gorsuch, surprisingly, may be a vote in favor of trans as a protected class based on some of the questions that he asked. Is that a misreading or wishful thinking on behalf of some of those op-ed writers?
Yeah, I think it's too much of a spin because they didn't understand what he was getting at. There were some questions about what would a harm be. The other side was saying, well, there would be no harm, and they're like, sure, there's a harm if a transgender person wanted to use a restroom of the opposite sex. There would be harm there. So he was asking those questions, and I think it's just a wrong spin. And I think what some of the justices, including Justice Gorsuch, were getting at, this has widespread consequences in different types of areas. For example, you've heard about the female athletes in Connecticut where you have young girls being displaced, losing scholarship, using victories because young men are now competing. And one of the athletic directors of the state said, for girls, you have a right to participate but not a right to win. So you look at the repercussions if you allow this to happen. Or there's women's shelters in Alaska where these women have abused and battered, domestic violence, raped, you name it, and where a man comes in and says, I am now a woman, I want to sleep in the same room next to them. And so there's widespread repercussions for these type of considerations, and I don't think the court's going to go for that because I think there's going to be not only a change of the law, but too much harm for women all the way around.
He is David Cortman, Senior Counsel and Vice President of U.S. Litigation with Alliance Defending Freedom. David, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Individual rates, coverage offerings, and savings may